Hello, and welcome to Sidentia Innovation's latest webinar, Minimal Lovable Product Using Empathy to Make Your Products Fly. I'm Kate Marcio, Director of Business Development for Sidentia Innovation, and I'll be your host for today's event. So before we begin, I'd just like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may also send in questions at any time during the presentation. Please also use the questions pane if you have any technical issues, and we'll do our best to resolve these for you. So I'm now delighted to introduce you to our presenter today, Carl Hewett. Carl is Director of Design at Sidentia Innovation. He attained a first-class degree from Loughborough University in Industrial Product Design and Technology. For 15 years, Carl has partnered with international clients, developing cutting-edge products and across diagnostics, dental, FMCG. Carl is passionate about creating impactful user experiences by blending technology and human factors into novel devices using in-depth experience in ethnography, needs translation, ideation, and design for manufacture. All right, Carl, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. Good to be here today. Hello to everyone, whatever time it is that you're dialing in to. So, as Kate said, today I'll be talking about Minimum Lovable Product. We'll take about 30 minutes to go through the content. We'll start with a bit of framing and context around products, why they fail when on the surface the right ingredients are there. We'll do some definitions very quickly of MVP versus MLP and how we cross the chasm. We'll then look at some considerations for MLP and then finally conclude with ways in which I think you can introduce methodologies, techniques, so you can connect with your customers to achieve a minimum lovable product. So cast your mind back, 2006, a leading consumer electronics giant broadcast to the world their latest and greatest touchscreen smartphone. And this isn't a story about Apple. This isn't the iPhone. This is actually the LG Prada. So what's really interesting for me, the LG Prada had a lot of parallels with the iPhone. It had the same touchscreen technology, TFT, similar aspect ratio, but it did some things that were loads better, in theory, from a technology perspective, than the iPhone. It had expandable memory, it had a flash-enabled camera back in 2006, it had Bluetooth connectivity, it even had the ability to expand the memory card. So all things that were better. So it's really curious to me why this wasn't the blueprint that we all talk about, or sort of the grandfather of every connected smart touch device that came from 2006. What's really interesting is the difference in development methodology. You see, LG just ported across their flash-based user interface from a previous generation of phone. And that previous generation of phone had the T9 style controls. I'm sure you all remember doing your touch on the buttons, going through the alphabet to do your text messaging. Digitizing that in a touchscreen environment really just negated the possibilities of what a touchscreen could enable. Now, conversely, Apple had a completely different design methodology. They put a lot of their effort and energy into the experience. I'm sure you can all remember the first time you picked up a phone that had the multi-touch user interface that Apple really pioneered, that idea of using your thumb and forefinger to zoom, to open and explore a document, to expand or zoom into a map. It was completely different. It really differentiated how you could interact with technology, with data. And I think it was a fundamental reason why an iPhone became that blueprint that went on. Experience really do beat technology in this instance. And it's something that we see time and time again. You could even go even further back, 1985. So contextually, this might not mean a lot to international audiences. You can think of Clive Sinclair, a company called Sinclair, sort of a more eccentric forefather to, say, Steve Jobs. He had a lot of success in the 70s and 80s with personal computing like the ZX8180 Spectrums. He even did the first pocket calculator. And in 1985, he was bang on trend again with a first foray into electrified vehicles. This is what this is here, the Sinclair C5. Really interesting technology. It was a battery-powered vehicle. It had a very lightweight tubular steel chassis. It had a fiberglass fiberglass sort of fairing that was co-developed by Lotus Engineering. So really interesting stuff. What was interesting to me is sort of what happened in the preceding year when it was released on market. It was bang on trend. At the time in 1985, there was the Iranian Revolution, oil crisis. Oil prices skyrocketed. Everyone was looking for ways to do more sustained modes of transport. So as I said, this was bang on trend. So why wasn't this something that was interesting to people? Why didn't it take off? It was a fundamentally terrifying reality. The picture here is of that time. It's a first user, we hope, that survived turning this corner. But you can see to road users, to the actual user himself, it was really at odds with all the other vehicles of that time. It had fundamental issues with technology. The battery drivetrain of that period were not particularly sophisticated, so anything more than a, say, 4% incline, the battery wouldn't have enough power to get you up the hill. It would cut out and you'd have to resort to your backup pedals. So you can imagine, as a sustainable consumer trying to get to work on your commute, battery cuts out, up a slight hill, and it's 99 kilograms, this device, so you'd get to work very, very sweaty. So just not a nice user experience. Interesting technology, but fundamentally the experience let it down. And again, you can divide that device up into its constituent components and rearrange it into something that's much more akin to the electrified scooters that we all see in urban environments today that are so much more successful. They're more accessible to people, they're fit for purpose, they don't have the perception issue that this had at that time. So again, experiences really matter. And this is where minimum lovable products can really help. So it's probably useful to go through a little bit of context with this. So a minimum viable product is a version of a product with just enough features to be usable for early customers. You're doing this so you can get feedback for future product development, these iterations. Minimum lovable product is similar, but has a subtle difference. It's still a product, a version of a product, but the features are just enough for customers to love the experience. It's a subtle difference, but it's really, really important when you take into the context of users in the development adoption curve. And what we're interested here is the different personas between your early market, so your innovators and your early adopters, and your mainstream market, and the early majority in particular. And I've divided the difference between those two by what I'm calling the MVP chasm. So your early adopters, they're willing to compromise. They're these people that are passionate, they like new things, they're happy perhaps if things aren't quite optimal. They might like hacking, tweaking devices, but certainly that excitement, word of mouth and referral, being the first to use said new technology is particularly exciting. The trouble is that same type of excitement, word of mouth referral, very, very rarely translates into the early majority, and it dies a death down in the chasm. And that's because the early majority want convenience, and this is where a minimum lovable product can really shine. These people want complete solutions. They're not happy to compromise. They want to enjoy a usable experience, not just tolerate something. And you'll see this a lot with the distinctions of why things like the LG or the Sinclair C5 that I shared, they were not fit complete solutions. They had a lot of teething problems that just did not gain traction with the early majority. That's why they failed on market. Sounds very simple, but there are some clear reasons why things don't work when we think about the product development life cycle. So I wanted to go through some examples of where we can better consider a minimum lovable mindset. One of the things I see many R&D teams struggle with is structural fixedness. It's this idea of this is how it was before, so this is how it always is. We saw that with the example with the LG Prada. We've got the old user interface, let's just port that across because, hey, it's touchscreen, that's going to be good enough, and it really isn't. Here's an even more dated example, 1940s TVs. 1940s TVs, when you look at the image there, the controls are to the left and right. And that was for really good practical reasons. The technology of the time with the tubes that were inside got very hot. They often used to get so warm that they'd explode. Certainly a lot of hot air and steam would come out of them. And the electronics and controls would melt if they were placed higher up above. So the controls, the speakers were deliberately put to the left and right. Curiously, come the 1950s, the transistor was invented, was widely adopted and used in microelectronics, negated the need for valves. The heating problem wasn't there anymore, yet time and time again, the user interface and controls were mounted to the side. This was in the 50s, the 60s, 70s. It wasn't really till the 80s you'd see things different with controls at the bottom or the top. And the problem with this is structural fixedness perhaps negates teams to take advantage of potential user benefits, unmet needs that perhaps are unaddressed. If you think about placing the controls at the top of the TV, that might negate, say, small children being able to reach and change the channel at that time before, say, remotes, or perhaps for someone with poor mobility, dexterity problems, having the controls at the top, you don't need to bend down so much to change the TV channel or the volume. So there's lots of perceived benefits that this structural fixedness can result in products that perhaps are not optimal. So you really need to try and get out of this, and we'll go through some methodologies how to overcome this later. It's still a thing that happens today. Here's an example here, more from medtech, intermittent cell catheters. So for those that aren't aware, these are things that you would insert up the urethra to void urine from the bladder if you have an impairment, mobility issues, that means that bladder function is not optimal. These have been around millennia ago. The first documented types of these devices were used dried rolled leaves or reeds with holes in the end that were reported to be used as a catheter. And fundamentally, the structure of them, i.e. a tube with a hole in the end, hadn't really changed even in the mid-2000s. You see an image there. Fundamentally, it's a tube with a hole in. Sure, there are modern materials, modern packaging, but it really hadn't changed much. And it took someone not until 2014, it's a company called Coloplast, that really took a different perspective of this. Fundamentally, there are, I guess, discretion and embarrassment issues around the use of these things. If you're a sufferer of it, you don't necessarily want to be publicized that you're using these within the office, but they're quite large, bulky things. Coloplast really embraced empathetic design, designed a product that could fit inside a handbag. On appearance, it looked like a mascara tube or some form of makeup. So from the outside observer, it doesn't necessarily look like you have a medical need that you're addressing with a product. So it's a really wonderful use of empathy, completely changed the landscape, and they've become a market leader in this. But again, it took someone to really think about pain points, problems. Don't just reference what's been done before, deliberately try and change. And if you do that, the experience becomes much more lovable. Another thing you see is people talking about the claims of their product and really trying to leverage that claim for differentiation when perhaps the base user experience is not that right. So something that's really good to do is to take that claim out of your product and just evaluate, does it still add up? So there's an example here of reusable nappies or reusable diapers. For those perhaps that haven't used them, instead of just throwing away a diaper, this is something here where you have an outer liner, an inner liner, and these are washable so that you, in theory, are a much more conscientious, sustainable user rather than putting single-use products with a disposable style nappy or diaper. If you think about the use cycle of this, and we start at the top at 12 o'clock, your baby would go for a poo or a wee. You need to get out your changing bag, you need to change them, and there's a smell. There's no difference to if you're using a disposable or a reusable. But at that point, when you assess the life cycle of a reusable, there are things that start to change, mitigations, changes in habits, pain points that you wouldn't have with a reusable, with the disposable diaper. So the first thing is the smell. You know, these things are now, you're not throwing them away, you have to put them in your bag. And you can imagine you'd be with other parents, you're out during the day and this thing smells. It's not a pleasant experience, but that's okay. There's a mitigation. You can put that in a scented bag. So I buy some scented bags now and I put them in my backpack for the day. That's fine. I get home and I need to wash these inner liners. Well, it's not too much of a difference. I still have to wash baby clothes anyway. They get soiled. That's fine. But I am washing more things now. I'm using more detergent. I'm using more water, more electricity. I'm even having to dry these in a air dryer, tumble dryer, perhaps more than I was doing before. So changes in habits, changes in use of energy and water that is less sustainable. The other thing I sometimes do, maybe I don't wash them singularly because that's not sustainable. So I put them in the dirty storage bin that comes with it, this plastic bin. That you can build up over a week, but in the heat of summer and you open that bin with these soiled inner liners of your nappies, it's not a nice experience at all. You don't do that very often. There's a smell to that bin. Maybe I need to buy an air freshener to cover that up. So again, more mitigations, more consumption of products I didn't buy before. And at the end, yep, I still need to dry these things, fold them up, put them in a way. It's not a change in habit particularly. But on balance, when you look at this life cycle, what has this new sustainable product introduced? It doesn't necessarily stack up from mitigations and pain points, change in habits, but as well, the sustainability aspect is perhaps not as good. So is this actually, on balance, the sustainable thing it's promised to be? So really important to do this more holistic view of a product. Make sure the experience is lovable, not just the potential of the singular claim. Another thing that's really important is to think about experiences that are human. And a really good thing we can do are jobs to be done. So context here, let's think about your gas or electric meter and having to take that meter reading, say for the first time, you're changing energy suppliers. The primary job is I want to submit my electric meter reading, and that's fine. Oftentimes, the difference between what is lovable or just a viable experience are companies, services, products that address those secondary jobs. So of course I need to submit my electricity meter, but in order to do that, first of all, I need to find my meter, then I need to see my meter, and then I need to input my readings. Oftentimes, those meters can be hidden away in a dark cupboard. It's dark. So what do? If you did the day in the life, the job to be done, when you analyze that, well, I'd need to get a torch, or I might have my smartphone. If I have my smartphone, I'm in perhaps the app that I'm using to input the meter reading in modern days. I need to close the app, swipe down, turn on my flashlight on my phone, put the app back up again, enter the meter reading, because I can see that now. This provider is Octopus Energy, and they really get a good handle on what you're doing. They've put the effort in to understand those secondary jobs. Such a simplistic addition to their app. It's just a little sliding button on the app which turns your light on and off. And it's things like that that are MLP. They're lovable experiences. You as a consumer are now using that. You get that little warm feeling. Yeah, this company gets me. They know exactly what I'm doing, and they provided the perfect service for me to fulfill that primary job. So you can get a feel here. It's about connecting with customers. It's about understanding needs and making sure that things that we are developing, products, services, anything of a hybrid nature really does connect. So it's important to understand some methodologies. And understanding people is all about empathy, and particularly understanding habituation. So I could spend another hour and talk to another webinar about ethnographical research. The idea of perception, so what people see and hear, use environments. We can use trends analysis for what influencers, friends, families, colleagues might be thinking. Ultimately, you are doing some form of cognition that makes you think and feel something. That could be negative, fears, frustrations, anxieties. They could be positive things, needs, hopes, motivations. And this process of perception cognition falls into action. Design engineering, innovation teams, they're great at doing the work for the perception cognition, but where I see a lot of issues are with the action side. What do people say and do? Because oftentimes what people say and do are very different to perhaps what they think they might do. And this is where ethnographical research can come in. Ethnographical research can be perceived as quite a lengthy and expensive process for some innovation teams, and they don't do it. So I thought it might be nice just to share some examples how we could perhaps introduce empathy into our innovation process in a different way, and thus achieve a more lovable experience. So one of the really good things to do is systematic inventive thinking. It's a process to inject empathy into your product development, and it's particularly good for very established products, things that perhaps have been quite static for quite a while. So the example here is a bicycle. Fundamentally, the image is there. The geometry of a bike was there or thereabouts sorted in and around the late 1800s, Victorian era. And modern bicycles, that sort of double triangle frame geometry hasn't changed drastically to this day. So we'll use that as an example. So the first thing you need to do is a functional decomposition, i.e. we separate the bike into its core functions, and we can list those functions in the horizontal. So we have from the left-hand side here, there's fuel. Actually, in this instance, there isn't any fuel. The motive force is your legs. You do input of that force through pedals. That's translated in a drivetrain through the chain, the sprocket. That motion is translated into the wheels. There's a chassis, which is made up of tubes that are welded together, and there's steering, which is a single pivot. And all of those things make a bike when you add it all together, from going from the left to the right to the actual concept. So once you've done that functional decomposition, you can apply thinking tools. So systematic inventive thinking, there are 4 core thinking tools, which is subtraction, which is removing an element. Multiplication is duplicating the element. Division is moving an element in time or space, and task unification is merging elements or functions. So we'll go through some examples how we can ideate using these tools, but specifically where the empathy aspect comes in. So subtraction, we remove an element. We can pick any element. The point isn't to spend your time deliberating over this. You can be quite arbitrary with what you pick. So we remove the pedals. And the first thing is to not discount the idea that your first thought might be, well, a bike with no pedals is absolutely pointless. Well, where is the value in that? You need, as ideation teams, to put your creativity into what value that might bring. Think of different end users, different scenarios, use environments, empathize. So here, if we took away pedals, one example would be children learning to ride a bike. They would see huge value in not having pedals that would be getting in the way of their feet. It allows them to focus purely on learning how to balance. And therein lies a different product category. So this is the idea. You remove the element, put your creativity into thinking of use cases, context, scenarios, empathy to create different ideas. And you can think of more and more and more. Duplicating an element, we could make 2 wheels. We could put the wheels at the front or the back, doesn't really matter. This example, think about a use case where 2 wheels at the front could add value. So a parent on a sustainable school run, she needs more balance, maybe she needs space in this example in the picture to put children in. It's a new product category. It's an adult trike. Division, this was moving the element in time or space. So here we select 2 elements, the pedals and the chain, and we're going to move them. We've moved them to the front of the bike. Don't discount the idea. Think of value that might bring. So in this instance, perhaps a user with limited arm function that can't bear their weight on a traditional design where the handlebars are placed. This recumbent version, sitting backwards, bearing weight more on the back and allowing you to steer differently, could have real value to that type of user with a limited arm function. So again, a different type of configuration, a different type of category, potentially an innovation source. And finally, task unification is merging elements or functions. So here we want to merge functions with wheels. We know wheels are moving, but they're doing other things as well. They're generating energy. We could think about energy recovery. So dynamos have been around for ages, but don't discount the idea. Think of the value it might bring. Illumination with a dynamo, visibility. It's a constant need that's not ever changing. This instance is actually integrating the lights into the wheel rims themselves as they move. You get wheel lights. So again, a different type of product format, a different source of innovation. So hopefully that just shows simplistically this idea of systematic inventive thinking, and it's something that you could apply to your product categories, and it doesn't need to be a physical product, it could actually be a service as well. So you could think of an end-to-end process for ordering some convenience goods or takeaway food. You can map out the individual parts of that service and you can apply these same thinking tools. And it's all about creating options. Peter Drucker's the sort of godfather of management consulting, always says the best way to predict the future is to create it, and you create it by making options. So SIT was one way to make options, but another way is analogous ideation. And I particularly like analogous ideation because it's using available information that's already got sources of richness in terms of market and consumer acceptance. It's this idea of looking to different categories, looking backwards to perhaps apply them to your own category. So if we think about an alternate coffee packaging experience, so that's your business that you're in, what might a different package experience be for coffee? Well, the first thing to do is to identify a comparable adjacent product. So here we could think about gravy granules. Gravy granules come in all manner of product formulations and also primary packaging. So on the left, from dry gravy granules in plastic jars or glass containers to dry sachets, to in the center there, more condensed cubes, to different formulations that are perhaps jelly in plastic primary packaging. We can even then start to get to more wet formulations in a Tetra Pak or in a can. But the nice thing is you can also look at completely non-direct. So we were talking about coffee, we used gravy, but here we could think about non-foods. Granules are also very, very commonplace in detergents. So on the left, we can get granulated detergents where you'd use a scoop to put that in your washing machine, but you can get a long one, the condensed pucks that you can use, the tablets. You can get formulations that are paper-based, where the detergent's impregnated on a paper towel that you can put into the drum of your washing machine. And then you can get more liquid-based formulations in plastic containers, and then you can get the more modern style that we've seen in the last 10 years, that's the sort of wettable, degradable, that dissolves, that's got a wet formulation inside. So we could pick that as inspiration, the more dissolvable tablet, the dissolvable pouch, and for any single formulation and primary pack, there are secondary packaging operations, packaging styles that we could choose. So we could say there's a plastic tub, there could be a more clear plastic liner, we could have cardboard, and we could have pulp-based boxes. We could also think about different consumer models, direct in store, we could have mail to models or refillable models. And the whole point of analogous ideation is to pick something and create your options. So if we like this idea of a dissolvable liquid with a cardboard secondary packaging that's mailed to, we could apply that back to coffee and say, well, what might that look like? You know, this is something that consumers are clearly accepting, and it's doing very well for that industry. Perhaps it would do well for coffee. So we could use, in this instance, a bit of generative AI to very quickly to create some really quick images to just depict what a mail order coffee bean might look like, that perhaps you could store in a glass jar and you could fill it up with hot milk, hot water to create this dissolving experience. Doesn't take long at all to do. It's an idea perhaps that's worked in another adjacency. Would it work for coffee? Who knows? But it's a quick route to create images and material to do A/B testing. So for me, analogous ideation is a really good way to inject empathy, because some of these ideas are pre-vetted. You're just changing the use context, changing it to a different market. So to wrap up, have you got an MLP? So what were we talking about? Well, MLP, Minimum Lovable Product, is a version of a product with just enough features for early customers to love the experience. And why are we talking about this? We want to jump the MVP chasm. We've got to win the hearts and minds of the mainstream market. Make sure the things we're doing are lovable, people are using and loving the product experiences, not tolerating it. So how do we do that? We talked about some methodologies to avoid things like structural fixedness and this technology push idea with the LG Prada and the Sinclair C5. Empathy is a great route to that, doing the PCA analysis and jobs to be done. And we use that richness and insight to create options. We can use the methodologies we've just been talking about with SIT and analogous ideation. We've got to remember just to sanity check what we're creating. Are they human experiences, jobs to be done? And does it add up to do that sort of life cycle analysis to, on balance, make sure it's the right thing? So thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions along the way, we can spend a bit of time answering those now.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks. That's a fascinating presentation, and empathy is near and dear to my heart. The examples you gave were really interesting. The Sinclair C5 is fascinating, how you could take a technology and on paper, it seems amazing, but then in the actual use case, as you mentioned, it's quite a terrifying experience. So yeah, I think really understanding the human experience is really at the core of a successful product. So we're going to go ahead and start with some questions. If you have any other questions that we don't get a chance to answer, we'll make sure to follow up with you in advance. So let's see what we have here in the chat panel. Here's a good question. So in the example you gave with the diaper, how would you make that into a minimum lovable product, for example?
Yep, that's a good one. It's a tricky one, isn't it? It's probably a solution space many people have been ideating around. Fundamentally, the solution there that we shared was almost a complete swap-in for the complete experience. You're trying to fundamentally create a nappy that follows that workflow. And as we ideated or demonstrated around, we introduced lots of pain points within that. Perhaps that wasn't the answer, i.e., why do people like using diapers and nappies? Primarily, there's a huge convenience aspect to it. You know, once it's been soiled, I can throw that away and I can forget about it. So one route you could ideate differently is to just look at that life cycle. So we talked about SIT and mapping out perhaps a process. Well, actually, what interests me is the bin process. When I've put that throwaway nappy in the bin, perhaps there's something we could do around that. Could we swap that out for a different process? Could we repurpose that for something different? So I know I've seen articles where nappies, for example, have been used in a different model where they go to a more, I guess, downcycling work stream where they're ground up and the raw materials are used to make roads. So that's an interesting concept because you're not changing the perception of convenience to the end user, but the outcome is perhaps something in a sustainable light because it's being downcycled for something different.
Yeah, I think the experience, there's a good intent behind it, but ultimately, if it's a terrible experience, it kind of outweighs the benefit you're trying to achieve in the end.
It does.
Yeah. All right, we have another question here. So what industry do you think has adopted minimal lovable product design the best that you've seen?
Consumer, definitely fast moving consumer. Areas where there is a high level of saturation, thereby the difference between use can be quite dramatic. So you can't afford to introduce a product in a very saturated market that isn't going to be loved by people. So consumer products are really good. So what would be a nice example? Say headphones, something like that. You know, you've had little headphones around for ages. Introducing something different that really addresses the pain points and completely shatters the mainstream would be, say, rechargeable headphones in the little pods. And the subtle bits in terms of, say, a secondary job to be done, say, like we spoke about, the fact that the pod that they go in is the thing that charges them. So you know when you go to open them for the first time, they're always at 100% charge. They're the little lovable features because there'd be nothing worse than a wireless set of headphones that you put them on and they had no battery. But that's been addressed in some way with the pods. So consumer brands are really good at doing that. So medical less so. They've got different challenges.
Do you see any good examples on the medical side or even consumer health side?
Consumer health, there's that little affinity more towards use in home, more fast moving. So continuous glucose meters, I'd say that's something that's recently getting a lot of news and press just about the usability of them, empowering people to manage, say, diabetes that they might have in a completely different way that gets rid of the go-to problems of the sort of finger prick and having to do that at a regular place. The fact you've got something constantly that's just monitoring, and when you introduce that closed loop control potentially for dosing insulin as well, say, that's really started to address things where people can almost forget their condition. It's a much more lovable experience by negating it.
Excellent. We have another interesting question. This topic comes up a lot. So how do you think AI will impact the minimum lovable product in general? Is AI play a role? Or can it play a role?
I think it could. And we're all in that hype bubble at the minute, and we're cautiously playing with tools and techniques. I said earlier on, ethnographical research can sometimes be perceived as a very lengthy and expensive process. Introducing empathy and perhaps cheaper ways into your product development process to try and generate lovable experiences is a good thing. And I think AI could support that in a similar way. We're seeing a lot of interesting applications of the ability for engines to be able to generate persona information to allow you initially to perhaps ideate around unmet needs, unrealized needs in a better way. And we're even seeing the emergence of synthetic users where you can create sort of populations, demographics, inject those into concepts to do artificial A/B testing. So potentially for companies that perhaps are time or resource short, that feel investing in this kind of thing is a negative, it perhaps offers a route to them. I qualify that, caveat that with, I think still there will be no replacement for actual end use interviews and ethnographical research, but it could potentially help companies get a head start with some of it.
Yeah, maybe it can kind of pinpoint areas to investigate further. But I agree. I think that it's hard to replace the human empathy aspect of it. But how can we use AI to advance or at least help us move in the right direction and see some of the correlations around different data and different use cases and so forth to kind of get you in the right direction. But yeah, the human experience and having a human involved in understanding that, I think, is still going to be quite prevalent and important. Another question. So I think this is a good question. I think a lot of R&D teams have. What are some of the barriers to R&D teams when embracing minimal lovable product mindset, if this is kind of new to their process?
Sure. So there's a big barrier in just this perception of time. The whole premise of an MVP is quick route to market. So the idea of suggesting to do something different that perhaps takes more time on surface value is a real negative. And I guess my counter to that would be, if you're developing viable, if you're developing a Gen 1 product that you're looking to put to market that is not what a customer needs, wants, desires, doesn't fully address pain points, I would argue you're wasting your time on viable. And that's why I just strongly believe that the lovable mindset is a better one, just to ensure that you are, at least as a bare minimum, you've got a clear articulation of what you're designing for, who you're designing for, pain points it addresses, and some validation that in doing what you're suggesting, you're going to make someone's life better. You're not just throwing something out to market that they just have to manage and tolerate. So it takes a leap of faith. It takes, I think, teams courage and confidence to invest in this type of work, and that's why the use of case studies sometimes for teams and legacy product war stories of things that have and haven't gone well are great, because another thing is teams sometimes look at things that are on market and wrongly frame them as MVP when they've had no appreciation of the empathy and the effort that's gone into understanding users and the early detail that's gone into creating lovable experiences. So I think that's a real misconception. People should stop using the term MVP. Certainly for hardware products where you can't fix it in software, you haven't got that quick Gen 2 fix when it requires revalidation, retooling, physical hardware changes. MVP is really, really risky.
Yeah, I see that often where teams that are pursuing an MVP believe that that's partly included in their minimal viable product and that they have considered that, but when it gets to the end, they've developed the product, they're now putting it in front of users, and all of a sudden there's so many things they're learning that they hadn't considered. Do you see that quite often?
It's the worst situation ever. If you do medical product development, say, when you've got the end to your summative study and you're still finding out new things, it happens with MVP, and you haven't done your homework, and that's the point of doing the iterative formative studies. And in some ways, the model, when we talk about MVP, it's that quick iteration, learn fast, learn what people want to better define and iterate. People aren't doing that process properly, and it just then not learning and just putting out an MVP is not the right route. So when you've done it right, that summative study is that tick box exercise at the end, because you've nailed all the features that you need to.
So I have a quick question, and I think I've heard this before. When it comes to minimal lovable product, why not create the most lovable product? Why minimal lovable?
Sure. And again, it's about efficiency. It's understanding doing one or two things really, really well rather than doing 5 things mediocre. And you have to triage sometimes the primary job to be done and what are those most impactful secondary jobs to be done to really make that primary job to be done as best as it can be. Doing something really, really well is long lasting. There's longevity in a product. There's no need to change it because why would you need to when it satisfies all of the needs? So you can go too far and you can start expanding more and more and more features and taking a product out of its core context, and then things can get quite complicated. So I'd always try and minimize specifications, minimize jobs to be done so that you're just doing as few things as possible really, really well.
Yep, speed to market is key, and there's always opportunity to build on that. And once you get the product in the market, you're going to learn so much more anyway. And instead of trying to pack it all into the initial release, learn a bit more, and then there's always opportunity to incorporate more of that minimal lovable product mindset. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Carl. I know we have a couple more questions. I think we're running short on time. So anyone who's asked questions, we'll be sure to address those afterwards. Please note, if you'd like to watch the presentation again, or if you'd like to share with your colleagues, you can find it on our website at sagentiainnovation.com in the coming days. If you'd like more information on the topics we've discussed or continue the conversation with us, please be in touch at info@sagentiainnovation.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn. So once you leave today's webinar, we'll go ahead and send a survey out. We'd appreciate if you could complete that. Your feedback is always very helpful to us in providing more meaningful content and content that you're most interested in. So for additional information to learn more about Sagentia Innovation, Please go ahead and follow us on LinkedIn. We're very interactive there and would love to connect with you. So on behalf of Synthesia Innovation and our presenter, Carl Hewett, thank you again for joining today's presentation, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.